Hey everybody, Johnny here from the One Human History channel. It's been a minute since I've made a video, but history has reared its head into the United States presidential election, and I just couldn't resist the opportunity to weigh in on the age-old question of what caused the Civil War. As many of you may have seen in the news this week, Nikki Haley has gone viral for her comments on what the cause of the Civil War was, failing to mention slavery as the cause or even a cause of that war. So in this video, I'd like to take a look at her comments, go point by point to see if it really was as bad as the newspapers are making it out to be. And by the end of the video, I'd like to talk about what I would say if I was asked the question, what caused the Civil War? So the other day at a town hall in Berlin, New Hampshire, presidential candidate and former ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, was asked by a voter what she thought the cause of the Civil War was. Let's get started by watching her answer, and we will stop throughout the video to analyze what she's saying and whether it has any resemblance to the historical reality.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Please, what was the cause of the United States Civil War?
Well, don't come with an easy question or anything. I mean, I think the cause of the Civil War was basically how government was going to run, the freedoms and what people could and couldn't do. What do you think the cause of the Civil War was?
So this is the first part of Nikki Haley's answer, and she basically says that the Civil War was fought over the role of government in determining what individual people can and cannot do. And I would say that, sort of generally speaking, that is not incorrect in and of itself. The Civil War was about what the government could or could not restrict with regards to individual freedoms and liberties. And you don't have to look far to find proof that this was the case. In fact, since Nikki Haley was a former governor of the state of South Carolina, why don't we just take a look at the South Carolina Articles of Secession to see why that state, which was the first state to secede, decided to leave the Union. And if you take a look, the first part of the document, which comprises probably about 80% of it, is a long and drawn-out explanation attempting to prove that each individual state of the United States was not subject to the federal government in perpetuity. That if a state felt like it was being mistreated, being treated unequally, that state had the right to withdraw from the Union. It talks about the Declaration of Independence and how in that document, the colonies were described as independent and sovereign states, each individually existing in its own right and each having the individual responsibility for its own governance. And that the federal government was created in order to protect and defend the individual sovereignty of each of those states. It talks about how each of these colonies entered the Union voluntarily as an individual sovereign state, and how if 4 of the 13 states had refused to join the Union at the time of the Revolution, that those 4 states would have remained individual and sovereign. So far, Nikki Haley's answer more or less checks out. South Carolina was seceding from the Union voluntarily as it felt was its right to do because in its view, the federal government had overstepped its limitations. However, and I know you've been waiting this entire minute for me to get to that big however, if we look at the rest of the document, we begin to see the South Carolina secessionists explain what the exact offending issue was. Where exactly was the federal government overstepping its bounds? Why were the southern states feeling that their sovereignty was under attack by a rogue federal government? The South Carolina Articles of Secession identify as the offending issue an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states toward the institution of slavery. It lists out a number of northern states which have failed in its obligations to protect slavery. And what this is referring to is a series of laws that the northern states had been passing in order to restrict a federal law, which was called the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, this federal law, this act of Congress, existed in order to force the northern states, which were free states, these were states where slavery was illegal, to enforce the laws of slavery. If somebody escaped slavery in the South and found themselves in a northern state, those northern states were obligated by an act of Congress, known as the Fugitive Slave Act, to do whatever they needed to do to capture that fugitive and send them back to the state. It's sort of like today, if somebody commits a crime in one state, that state can't just let that person walk around freely. They're obligated to capture that person and send them back to the state where they committed the crime for trial. So in this case, you have a series of states that are refusing to enforce an act of Congress and enforce slavery laws. It's kind of interesting because they go on and on and on about the sovereign rights of the states, but their first complaint is about the individual sovereign states of the North refusing to enforce a federal law. I don't know. That sort of broke my brain a little bit. That's a little confusing. Seems like a contradiction. Maybe some of you legal scholars have a better explanation as to why that might not be a contradiction. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments on that one. The next issue is that big issue that always divides us as Americans. We don't like the president. And in this case, we're talking about Abraham Lincoln and the election of 1860. And according to these articles, a group of northern states united to elect a president hostile to slavery, despite the fact that his mandate is to govern the whole nation. Now, if you look at the electoral map of 1860, it is true. Only the northern states voted for Abraham Lincoln. And by virtue of the northern states having far more electoral college votes than the southern states, Abraham Lincoln won. So he was basically a president elected by only one section of the country, but he was elected to govern the whole country. And not only that, but this particular president had expressed hostility to slavery. In fact, the South Carolina Articles of Secession claim that once Abraham Lincoln takes office, he is going to enact a war against slavery, which is going to be a threat to the equal rights of the states and nullify their self-government. So every one of those states that allows slavery in their state is going to be under attack by a rogue anti-slavery abolitionist president. We don't have to get into the fact that Abraham Lincoln, on multiple occasions when he took office, swore that he would not free the slaves, and that even after the war started, he did everything he could to save the Union without freeing the slaves until he was finally forced to do so in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. Still, according to South Carolina, Abraham Lincoln on day one was going to axe slavery, completely nullifying the individual rights of the states. The articles even make a claim that the Constitution itself had enshrined their legal right to owning property in the form of slaves. The Constitution does not mention slavery, except sort of tangentially in the infamous 3/5 Compromise. And according to South Carolina, the 3/5 Compromise recognized the right to own slaves by taxing individual free citizens based on the number of slaves they owned. So if the federal government can tax you for the number of slaves that you own, that is an implicit recognition of the right to owning slaves. I would agree that the Constitution implicitly recognized the right to own slaves, as the South Carolinians suggested. So in that sense, it is very strange for Nikki Haley to neglect mentioning slavery as a cause of the Civil War, considering that this was the single offending issue that South Carolina mentions as to why it felt its state sovereignty was under attack by the federal government. Now, I took all of that out of like 2 sentences that Nikki Haley said. She does say more. She does attempt to expound on her view. Let's take a look at what she says a little bit later in the video.
I mean, I think it always comes down to the role of government and what the rights of the people are. And I will always stand by the fact that I think government was intended to secure the rights and freedoms of the people. It was never meant to be all things to all people. Government doesn't need to tell you how to live your life. They don't need to tell you what you can and can't do. They don't need to be a part of your life. They need to make sure that you have freedom. We need to have capitalism. We need to have economic freedom. We need to make sure that we do all things so that individuals have the liberties so that they can have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to do or be anything they want to be without government getting in the way.
Thank you. And then in the year 2023, it's astonishing to me that you answer that question without mentioning the word slavery.
What do you want me to say about slavery?
So in the second part of this answer, we get a little bit more of a sense of what Nikki Haley's thoughts really are on the cause of the Civil War. And she says that it was really a conflict about how government would run and what kind of freedoms people could and could not have. It was about the role of government in determining what individual liberties people had, what rights people had, and that those rights touched on different sectors of life, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of economic activity. Now, I have to say that I feel like Nikki Haley, if I could be so bold, was starting to feel like she was losing control of her answer to this question a little bit. And so it's hard for me to pinpoint in everything she says kind of like a unified answer. There's a lot of kind of swaying and going in directions that I can't completely follow. But I want to pick out the parts of her answers that I thought made more sense than the other parts, or at least are more applicable to this situation. And I think that her mentioning the federal government's right to restrict economic activity, and that the federal government was not meant to play such an active role in restricting economic activity. So I think in a very broad sense, once again, this is sort of correct. The Civil War was fought over whether the federal government was allowed to restrict a certain form of economic activity. That form of economic activity being slavery. And what makes Nikki Haley's answer very strange, and probably has a lot to do with why it went viral, is that she seems to be suggesting that the federal government did not have the right to restrict this form of economic activity. Because if the Civil War was about whether or not the government has the right to restrict slavery, and if Nikki Haley believes that the government really shouldn't be restricting economic activity and the liberty to sort of run your business the way you'd want to run it, then by that logic, the government did not have the right to restrict slavery. Which, of course, begs the question, is Nikki Haley arguing, intentionally or unintentionally, that slavery should not have been outlawed in the United States? Was the outlawing of slavery an example of individuals being prevented from doing whatever they want without the government getting in the way? Well, it just so happens that in the aftermath of these comments, Nikki Haley did another town hall in which she attempted to further explain her views on the Civil War and slavery. Let's take a listen.
Last night I was asked about the Civil War and what I think of the Civil War, what was the cause of the Civil War. Of course the Civil War was about slavery. We know that. That's unquestioned, always the case. We know the Civil War was about slavery. But it was also more than that. It was about the freedoms of every individual. It was about the role of government. For 80 years, America had the decision and the moral question of whether slavery was a good thing and whether government, economically, culturally, any other reasons, had a role to play in that. By the grace of God, we did the right thing and slavery is no more. But the lessons of what that bigger issue with the Civil War are is that let's not forget what came out of that, which is government's role, individual liberties, freedom for every single person, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to do and be anything you want to be without anyone or government getting in your way. That should be the goal of what we always try and take away from that, right? Because we never want to return back to that place. But we always want to remember the lesson of what it means to be a free individual and that everyone deserves to be a free individual.
So once again, it's kind of hard for me to comment on this specific answer because Nikki Haley goes a little bit all over the place, but I'll try to extract some of the morsels of what she's trying to say and give my opinion here on whether I think what she's saying makes any sense. First of all, she unequivocally says that the Civil War was about slavery, so 1 point for that. Let's say 1 point out of 20, because it's not that much of an admission. I mean, even if you think the Civil War was about states' rights primarily, slavery still was the major issue that pushed this conflict to the breaking point. However, I find it interesting that in the first video, she makes such a strong argument that we need to be careful about the federal government restricting individuals' rights to participate in economic activity, to be whatever they want to be without the government getting in their way. What if somebody wants to be a slaveholder? As it happens, many people did. In fact, when I was a tour guide at a Civil War cemetery, I used to tell the story of some of the immigrants from Europe who moved to the United States specifically to become slaveholders. They came to America with the American dream of owning slaves. So when many people thought about what it meant to be an American and why it was worth being an American, to them it was to own slaves. So the federal government stepping in and now saying that you couldn't own slaves would ostensibly be an example of what Nikki Haley is complaining about, the federal government preventing people from being who they want to be. However, it is clear that Nikki Haley recognizes that slavery in itself is wrong and that she's on the side of ending slavery, that she thinks slavery should be outlawed. She just seems to disagree with the way in which slavery was outlawed, although she believes that the ends justified the means, and therefore, even though the federal government overstepped its mandate in outlawing slavery, it should have done that because slavery was morally wrong. To me, that's a pretty contradictory way of looking at it. I think Nikki Haley just can't square the fact that the logical conclusion of her argument would be that slavery would have stayed intact in the United States because slavery is bad. And so she says that I disagree with federal government overstepping its bounds, states' rights, all that's great. I'm 100% in that camp, except in one specific case, that case being the case of slavery. And then she goes on to say that the lesson of the Civil War is a warning about how a federal government can overstep its bounds. Do I think that that's the lesson of the Civil War, that it serves as a warning to us against the excesses of federal power? I think you could make an argument that that's the case. I think you could make a pretty solid argument. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during his presidency. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the United States passed 3 amendments which gave the federal government much, much more power than it had ever had to police the individual rights of America's citizens. And I do agree that those are all important things to discuss when talking about the legacies of Abraham Lincoln's presidency, of the federal government's actions during the Civil War and during Reconstruction. However, I think the Civil War teaches us that a system of overt economic oppression and unfreedom cannot survive in a country that has built itself on the principles of self-government and freedom. You can't talk about self-government when you're keeping individual people enslaved. It also shows us the lengths to which some people were willing to go in order to protect their economic interests. They were willing to destroy this country, which we all share to this day, just to protect slavery. And when Abraham Lincoln took office and those states seceded, he refused to allow them to do that. He refused to allow them to destroy this country. And he was willing to do extraordinary things, things that the federal government had never done before, in order to prevent this nation from falling apart. And it's interesting that I mentioned Abraham Lincoln in this moment because he gave a very famous speech about the Civil War called the Gettysburg Address. It's considered the speech which sums up the reason why the Civil War took place. And one thing that's interesting about that speech is there's an issue which Abraham Lincoln neglects to mention in it, and that issue is slavery. To Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War was about whether government of the people, by the people, and for the people could survive a civil war. Can you imagine if Abraham Lincoln gave this speech at a campaign stop today? Someone might say,
In the year 2023, it's astonishing to me that you answer that question without mentioning the word slavery.
Still, that doesn't mean Abraham Lincoln didn't believe the Civil War was about slavery. He most certainly did. Don't forget that this is just one speech that Abraham Lincoln gave. It's a speech he gave at the dedication of a cemetery at the Gettysburg battlefield, just 4 or 5 months after the greatest and most bloody battle of the Civil War had taken place. He was trying to comfort the families. He was not speaking about contentious political issues like slavery in that speech. The great follow-up to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, his second inaugural address, mentions slavery many times and explains how the Civil War, in Abraham Lincoln's view, was in fact about whether or not the United States should continue to have slavery. And in fact, Abraham Lincoln's last great act as president was to see the passage of the 13th Amendment through Congress and sign it, that amendment officially banning slavery in the United States, outlawing slavery in the United States, except as punishment of a crime. So to finish off this video, I'd like to, as promised, explain what I would say if I were asked the question, what was the cause of the United States Civil War? And I would say simply this. The United States Civil War happened because a series of southern states seceded from the Union, and the federal government under President Abraham Lincoln refused to allow them to secede. When one of those states attacked a federal fort, the United States Army went in to the South and the Civil War began. The reason why those states seceded was slavery. And that, my friends, right there, is my answer to what caused the Civil War. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. This was a video that I frankly made on a whim. I saw this video of Nikki Haley, and frankly, it's been a while since I've been a tour guide, so I haven't had an opportunity really to talk about the Civil War like I used to. I haven't made a video on this channel for a long time because I've been very busy. I actually moved to Poland. Ja przeprowadziłem się do Polski I teraz uczę się polskiego. I said I moved to Poland and I'm studying Polish now. So I've been really busy learning all of the grammar and vocabulary, and I haven't had much time to read books about history, but I just thought that this was an awesome opportunity to come back and talk to you guys after a long time and give my opinions on a subject that I studied for many, many years and talked about for many years. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch my video, and hopefully I'll be able to post some more as history makes an appearance in our modern day.